For years, we thought the Jedi were the ultimate heroes of the galaxy, the guardians of peace, protectors of justice, the light side's greatest warriors. But what if we were wrong? What if the Jedi Order wasn't the noble, righteous institution we thought it was? What if the Jedi were actually corrupt, manipulative, and responsible for their own downfall? Because when you look deeper into their actions, the truth is shocking.
What?
They weren't just victims of the Sith. They were part of the problem, and in some ways, maybe the Sith wasn't entirely wrong. Today, we're diving into the dark truth about the Jedi Order. From their rigid, emotionless rules, to their hypocrisy, to their role in creating one of the most feared Sith Lords of all time. By the end of this video, you may never see Star Wars the same way again. Let's start with one of the Jedi's biggest flaws: their extreme, almost cult-like rules. The Jedi Order demanded total emotional suppression. Love, anger, attachment, even simple fear, all of it was strictly forbidden. That sounds wise in theory, but think about how unnatural that is. The Jedi believed emotions led to the dark side.
Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
They forced their members to suppress their feelings instead of learning to control them. And guess what? That suppression backfired. Just ask Anakin. But it gets worse because the Jedi didn't just suppress emotions. They also took children from their families at birth and raised them to obey without question. Think about that for a second. These weren't just students. They were literally taken as infants and indoctrinated into a strict, controlled way of life with no choice. No attachment to family, no alternative paths. Just become a Jedi or leave and risk being hunted like a traitor. So let me ask you, does that sound like a peaceful order or does that sound like a cult? Now, let's talk about the Jedi's political influence. The Jedi claimed to be peacekeepers, but in reality, they were tools of war. They didn't serve the galaxy. They served the Republic, the same Republic that was full of corruption, greed, and backdoor deals. The Jedi willingly fought in the Clone Wars, leading child soldiers. Yes, the clone troopers were essentially child soldiers, grown artificially for war. Think about how messed up that is. The Jedi, these so-called defenders of peace, saw a massive army of literal clones, humans who had no freedom, no choice, just built for war, and instead of stopping it, they accepted it. They used it to their advantage. And yet they called the Sith the evil ones. And let's not forget, while the Jedi were busy policing the galaxy, Palpatine played them all like fools. The Jedi Council had immense political power, but they still failed to see the Sith rising right under their noses. Was it blindness or arrogance? The Jedi Council was supposed to be the wisest, most enlightened group in the galaxy. They sat above politics, above conflict, and claimed to be the ultimate guardians of peace and justice. But in reality, the council was as flawed, biased, and hypocritical as any government they claimed to oppose. Their greatest hypocrisy was their insistence on selflessness, yet time and time again, they acted in their own interests, often at the cost of others. They claimed the Jedi were free of attachments, but they were deeply attached to their own power and traditions. They claimed to be protectors of the Republic, yet they willingly led armies into war. And when it came to their own rules, they enforced them selectively, favoring those who followed blindly while punishing those who dared to question them. Qui-Gon Jinn was one of the few Jedi who believed in the living force, a more instinctual, natural connection to the galaxy rather than the strict, dogmatic teachings of the Order. He refused to blindly obey the Council and instead trusted his intuition. The result? The Jedi rejected him, denied him a seat on the Council, and saw him as a reckless outsider.
If you would just follow the code, you would be on the Council.
Yet Qui-Gon was the only Jedi who sensed the true importance of Anakin Skywalker. He believed the Chosen One prophecy was real when the Council dismissed it.
No, he will not be trained.
No.
And the irony? Had they listened to Qui-Gon instead of rejecting him, the fate of the galaxy may have been completely different. The Jedi believed Anakin was the Chosen One, yet they never fully accepted him.
You are on this council. but we do not grant you the rank of master.
They refused to grant him the rank of master despite his skill and contributions. They constantly reminded him to suppress his emotions, yet they put him in positions that demanded emotional strength. Then there is Ahsoka Tano. She was one of the most devoted Jedi of her time. She fought for the Order, followed its teachings, and served with unwavering loyalty. But when she was falsely accused of a crime she didn't commit, the Council turned their backs on her. Instead of defending one of their own, they allowed her to be judged and sentenced without real evidence. When her innocence was finally proven, they offered to welcome her back, as if nothing had happened. Ahsoka's response? She walked away. She saw the Jedi for what they truly were, an organization that valued its reputation over its people. Time and time again, the Jedi betrayed their own members. They exiled those who challenged their doctrine, dismissed those who thought differently, and refused to admit their own mistakes. The result? They lost Qui-Gon, they lost Anakin, they lost Ahsoka, and eventually, they lost everything. One of the greatest tragedies of Star Wars is the fall of Anakin Skywalker, the chosen one, the hero who was meant to bring balance to the Force. Instead, he became Darth Vader, the most feared Sith in history. But here's the real question. Was this truly his fault, or did the Jedi push him to the dark side? Anakin was taken from his mother at age 9 and expected to immediately conform to Jedi discipline. He was told to suppress his emotions, even though he suffered deep trauma from leaving his home and his mother. His attachment to Padme was seen as a weakness instead of being acknowledged as part of his humanity. Anakin suffered nightmares of his mother's suffering, but the Jedi refused to let him intervene. When he lost her, instead of receiving guidance, he was told to simply let go of his grief, something no person could realistically do. He feared losing Padme the same way, but the Jedi offered no help, no support, and no understanding. Palpatine did something the Jedi never did. He listened. He validated Anakin's fears instead of dismissing them. He offered a solution to Anakin's pain, while the Jedi only gave restrictions.
Did you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise?
Anakin wasn't drawn to the dark side out of power-hungry ambition. He turned because he believed it was the only way to save Padme. In the end, the Jedi gave Anakin no choice. They pushed him away, ignored his struggles, and failed to guide him when he needed them most. And when he finally acted out of fear and desperation, they turned against him completely. One of the greatest weaknesses of the Jedi was their arrogance. They truly believed they were the only ones who understood the Force. They saw themselves as the ultimate moral authority, untouchable, infallible, and superior to all other Force users. But the truth? Their arrogance was their undoing. The Jedi were not the only Force-sensitive beings in the galaxy. There were other Force traditions like the Night Sisters, the Guardians of the Wills, and even the Bendu. Instead of learning from them, the Jedi dismissed these groups entirely, believing their own way was the only way. They viewed different interpretations of the Force as dangerous rather than opportunities to learn. The Jedi's philosophy had remained unchanged for thousands of years. They never evolved, never questioned, never reconsidered their beliefs. The Sith did evolve. They adapted, they changed their strategies, and they learned from their mistakes. The Jedi remained stagnant, believing that because they had survived for so long, they could never be wrong.
However, you will be giving into attachment to those that you love, and forsaking the way of the Jedi.
This arrogance made them blind, not just to their own flaws, but to the growing strength of their enemies. Even as the Republic fell into corruption, the Jedi refused to believe they had lost control. They underestimated Count Dooku, ignored the growing influence of Palpatine, and dismissed warnings about the Sith. Mace Windu believed the Jedi had the power to overthrow the Senate, showing just how far they had strayed from their original purpose.
In the name of the Galactic Senate of the Republic, you're under arrest, Chancellor.
Qui-Gon saw the dangers of the Order's rigid thinking long before its downfall. He believed in something called the living force, a deeper, more instinctual connection to the galaxy.
Midichlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells.
Unlike the Jedi Council, Qui-Gon understood that the Force was not just about rules and tradition, but about listening, feeling, and adapting to the moment. But instead of embracing his wisdom, the Jedi ignored him. The Jedi saw the Force as something to be controlled, while Qui-Gon saw it as something to be understood. Qui-Gon trusted the Force to guide him, while the Jedi relied on ancient texts and doctrine. He believed in acting on intuition, but the Council dismissed him as reckless. Qui-Gon's approach was closer to true balance, yet the Jedi saw him as a problem. Qui-Gon was denied a seat on the Jedi Council because he didn't blindly follow orders. He was considered a radical, even though he was the only Jedi truly in tune with the Force. His greatest discovery, Anakin Skywalker, was met with skepticism instead of belief. If the Jedi had embraced Qui-Gon's teachings, would Anakin have fallen to the dark side at all? Qui-Gon's death was more than just the loss of a great Jedi. It was the loss of the Order's last hope for evolution. Had he lived, he could have trained Anakin properly, guiding him in a way the Council never could. Instead, his teachings were lost, and the Jedi doubled down on their rigid ways. The fall of the Jedi was not the work of the Sith alone. It was not just the betrayal of Anakin Skywalker or the manipulations of Palpatine. It was something far greater. It was the Jedi themselves. Their arrogance, their unwillingness to change, their rigid, outdated beliefs, their failure to protect their own. They had the chance to evolve, to listen, to be better, but they refused, and because of that, they lost everything. The Jedi Order did not fall because they were weak. They fell because they were flawed. They were arrogant, believing their way was the only way. They refused to adapt, ignoring those who saw the Force differently. They failed to protect their own, abandoning Jedi, who struggled rather than guiding them back. Their strict, outdated beliefs blinded them to the growing darkness. They ignored Qui-Gon's wisdom. They dismissed Anakin's pain. They pushed Ahsoka away. And when their greatest warrior, the Chosen One, needed help the most, they left him to fall. By the time they realized their mistakes, it was already too late. The Sith didn't need to destroy them. The Jedi had already destroyed themselves. The Jedi once stood as the protectors of peace and justice. But in their final days, they became lost. They ignored warning signs. They allowed corruption to fester. They placed faith in outdated traditions instead of evolving with the galaxy. And in the end, their fall was not the work of the Sith alone. It was the result of their own unwillingness to change. Perhaps, if they had listened, if they had guided instead of rejected, if they had adapted instead of controlled, the galaxy would have had a different fate. But history is written by those who survive, and the Jedi did not. But now, the Jedi are gone. Their teachings, their order, their legacy, all of it has faded into history. So now, we are left with a question. Should the Jedi return? Should they rebuild, risking the same failures? Or should something new rise in their place? Or should the Jedi stay buried in history, allowing the Force to find a new path? Now, did the Jedi deserve to fall? Were they victims of the Sith, or were they responsible for their own downfall? And most importantly, should the Jedi ever return? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Star Wars, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more in-depth analysis. Boy,